Okay, I think we're going to get started. Hello and welcome to Advancing Hemp with Biological Solutions, a sponsored webinar brought to you by Marrone Bio Innovations. I'm Ben Trollinger, editor of Acres U.S.A. magazine. Today we welcome presenters Matthew Brecht and Tim Johnson, both Ph.D.s and both from Marone Bio Innovations. Matthew Brecht is a cannabis grower, hemp expert, and plant pathologist. Tim Johnson is a biological expert and entomologist. Today, they're going to tag team a presentation on managing disease within hemp growing systems. They'll also provide an overview of biological products, some of their field data, and some best practices for growing hemp. Before I hand it over to Matt and Tim, I wanted to ask them a few simple questions that might help us define our terms a little bit. First of all, what are biologicals and how do they work? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll start with that, Ben. Thanks for the introduction. So when we refer to biopesticides today in this presentation, we're going to be talking about products that are registered with the EPA through their what's called the BPPD division that is set up specifically for registering biological products as pesticides. And that means these are materials that meet the legal definition of a pesticide under FIFRA. So these are products that are EPA registered. There are also some products that are exempt from EPA regulation. Typically, they're materials generally recognized as safe. They are a fairly small segment of the market. So when we talk about biologicals, we're talking about biopesticides, but in the broader term, that can also, of course, include beneficial insects, biocontrol agents or BCAs.
Matt, do you have anything to add to that? I think you're on mute. There we go.
Go ahead, Matt. Oh, still don't hear you.
Okay, we can come back to that one. But Tim, I want to just follow up a little bit on that. You were talking about EPA registration, but how do we know which biologicals will work?
Well, that's a really good question because EPA does not act as a clearinghouse when it comes to efficacy. So in that regard, I would encourage growers to ask the manufacturers for data to support their product uses. Definitely would look for them to go to independent third parties such as university experts and extension folks to see what information they might have. And of course, still very recently, most of those folks were not able to work on hemp because they had prohibitions against working on it till USDA finally deregulated the crop and allowed it to be planted in various states. So we'll probably get into that in a little bit later, but it's been a unique history in agriculture, a unique experiment in agriculture to decide to go ahead and grow a new crop where we had so little internal expertise, and many of the people that did have expertise because of previous experience in growing cannabis were a little bit in the shadows. So we didn't have the usual infrastructure within USDA and our land grant university system to work with growers, but we're catching up. They're doing a pretty good job there.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Okay.
You guys hear me?
We can now. Success.
Oh, big. All right.
Okay, well, feel free to jump in now that we...
Yeah, no, I think basically what I was saying is Tim pretty much said it, said what I thought should be said. So yeah.
Great. I want to remind everyone that you can submit questions into the chat. There will be a Q&A after the presentation. So be sure to do that throughout the presentation just so we can collect those and make sure we get to as many as we possibly can. And without further ado, I'm going to kick things over to Matt and Tim.
Thanks, Ben.
So I'm going to start off a little bit of an introduction, then I'm going to turn it over to Matt. We talk about plant diseases, and then I'll follow up and we talk about insect pests. So today we're going to talk, Matt will touch briefly on hemp regulation update and common diseases, and then we'll get into the insects. But first we'll go to a safe harbor statement. Matt and I both work for a company called Marone Bio Innovations. We are a publicly traded company on the NASDAQ exchange. And basically this slide reminds anybody participating in this webinar that if they have any interest in investing in the company, to do a thorough due diligence far beyond what we're going to be talking about here today. So the company, real briefly, was founded in 2006. So this is our 15th anniversary. We're headquartered in Davis, California. We have a manufacturing plant that we're expanding right now in Southwest Michigan, near a little town of Bangor, Michigan. We are very aggressive in terms of protecting our intellectual property. So we have a patent portfolio both in the United States and worldwide. And we are a biological company. We used to refer to ourselves as a biopesticide company, but we've expanded in the past 2 years to plant nutritional products as well. But by and large, when we're looking at biopesticides, most of our emphasis has been using microorganisms and compounds they produce for beneficial use in agriculture. But we do also work with plant extracts, and we'll actually be talking about both of those types of products today. We have a nationwide sales and technical support group here in the United States, which we'll touch on at the very end. And we do have global distribution. We do business in the US, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, a few other LATAM countries, as well as Europe and South Africa. Next slide. Just real briefly, we are now into 3 different segments of agriculture and production. We have what we call our crop protection group, which is our fungicide, bactericide, disinfectant products based on peroxyacetic acid. We have fungicide plant health products with Regalia and Stargus, as well as a crop stress reduction product in Haven. And then we have our portfolio of insecticides and nematicides that I'll go into in some detail that are sold under various trade names depending on the market segment. And then more recently, we acquired a crop nutrition business out of Europe called ProFarm. That's focuses on seed treatment and foliar fertilizers. And then this year, coming from our Marrone group, is a plant health product called Pace Setter for Midwestern agriculture. Just real quick, looking at our product portfolio overview. We have the fungicide, bactericide segment, fungicide and plant health, insecticide and nematicide, crop stress reduction, plant health, nutritional seed treatment, and foliar fertilizer. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to hand this over to Matt. He's going to talk a little bit about his regulatory status update on hemp and our various products. And then I think from there we go into the plant disease part of the presentation. All yours, Matt.
Okay. Very good. So when it comes to the state of cannabis and hemp in general in the United States, obviously you guys know that it's broken up by states. So states have their own sort of list of products you can use on cannabis and hemp. Not all states are allowing cannabis, and 46, I believe, the states are allowing the growing of hemp. So it becomes, when people call us from different states, we then have to figure out, okay, well, which of the products are actually allowed in your state. And so, depending on which state you're in, you're gonna have to do some due diligence on which products are legally available to be used. Now, having said that, Regalia CG has been approved for hemp in California, and as well as the regular Regalia approved for hemp in all states except for California. So if you're in California right now, just know that the legal label is the CG products, and that's just because there's a language that's on those labels versus the ag side of the product. Stargus has been approved for hemp in all states except for California right now. We should have that on soon. Jet Ag, our 5%, is also approved for hemp in many states: Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut. You can read there. And Grandivo CG and Venerate CG also have approvals of our products on hemp and also in cannabis in many of these states. So as far as what's approved, you can find your state on this list to make sure that it is there. So hopefully this is the current state, the current registration list, and we update this list almost monthly. Okay, what's the difference between CG versus ag label? So CG is something we call a cultivated garden. To be frank, originally I believe it was called cannabis garden or cannabis grower, but the cultivated garden is more of an umbrella that not only has hemp and cannabis, but it also has greenhouse-grown vegetables and ornamentals. So what's the difference between the CG and ag products besides the labels and what's allowed in that state as far as registration goes? Well, CG products also have another level of testing that we do because things that are grown in the greenhouses in cannabis and hemp tend to be much more sensitive, and there's a higher level of testing that goes on to make sure that they don't have any residues. And so if you're growing, cannabis or hemp, you're going to have it tested, and it can have heavy metals in it. It can have pesticide residues, human pathogens, and other things. And all of our cultivated garden or CG products have an extra level of testing that they go through that the ag side does not get. So when you're using a CG product, you know that there's nothing in it that's going to fail a test. In fact, we've had to apply these products sometimes 2x, 3x the rate, and 10 to 12 to 15 times on a plant, and it'll never fail a test for anything, even including heavy metals. It's because there's nothing in it. It's really, really good, very, very safe. And we know that we're getting some really good health benefits with regalia, as you can see in that picture right there. If you apply our products, not only do you get disease control, but for regalia you get some plant health, and that we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we're going to go real briefly through the common hemp diseases and some of the biological solutions. The main things that we worry about are powdery mildew, botrytis bud rot, and fusarium, which is basically a root and stem rot. Many people talk about pythium. That can be a thing inside in the grow room, especially if you're using like a deep water culture or a recirculating system that has proper cleanliness to the water. But really, these are the three biggest diseases. Of course, hemp grown outside has actually other diseases as well, but they're pretty minor compared to these three. So powdery mildew, as we know, is this white mycelia gets everywhere, and then in that mycelia there's a whole bunch of these tiny little spores that readily blow around the air all the time, and it's almost no matter where you go, you're always going to have powdery mildew flowering or spores flying around in the air. So what you're seeing right here is obviously sort of a bottom leaf, big leaf has been infected by powdery mildew, and of course powdery mildew is on the top side of the leaves. And when we're thinking about powdery mildew and you're going to testing, it's not necessarily, you can have some powdery mildew on your plant and it'll pass, but it's when you get the powdery mildew on the flower and the sugar leaves you see on the left-hand side there, that's when, you can get rejected as far as, testing goes. And parasitic acids are the Jet Ag product, or if you guys know a product called Xeritol. Those are the hydrogen peroxide parasitic acid combinations where you spray down that plant. It basically dissolves the mycelia, cleans the spores, or disinfects the spores, and wipes it from the plant. And that's something people use at the end of the grow. Regalia CG really helps to prevent all of this. But what you should know is if once you do clean up the powdery mildew from that leaf, that powdery mildew is still inside the top layers of the cells of that leaf. So within 7 to 10 days, you can see a reemergence of that mycelia to produce new spores. Next slide. Botrytis bud rot, the bane of everyone's outside growing. Indoors, we have very little of it. But in the outside world, especially in 2019, we saw an immense amount of bud rot. And that's, obviously it's a terrible thing when you have thousands and thousands of dollars invested in it, and all of a sudden at the end of the crop, 3 weeks prior to harvest, 20% of your flower is destroyed. It's not a good thing. So in order to prevent this, you want to make sure that you get some products into that plant before that flower cola stacks and closes, basically. because the bud rot's inside, the botrytis is inside, and that nice humid environment it can take off. And what I recommend is to use Stargus at 2 to 3 applications right at mid-flower where it's stacking. And also Regalia will greatly reduce any kind of bud rot. In fact, several sprays of Regalia and a spray or two of Stargus will reduce your bud rot from, like, let's say 25% to maybe 3 to 4%, which is thousands and thousands of dollars of savings for you. And the third one I'm going to talk about, especially when it's indoors, not so much outdoor grown, but more of an indoor grown when you're growing your seedlings, your transplants for the outdoor fields. This is where Fusarium can give you a stem rot. So the bottom left picture there, you can see this right on the stem line between the soil and maybe about 2 inches up. You see this sort of white and wet sort of stem, and that's the rot that's being caused by the Fusarium. The top left picture is the Fusarium that's sporulating, so it's producing spores, and that's on a mother plant. And you can see that on the right-hand pictures, you can see the different mother plants and the effects of Fusarium. It'll give this sort of pinkish hue to the plants. And this is where your inoculum comes from for your seedling. So, treat your mother plants nicely. Make sure you spray them down the same amount as you spraying down the rest of your plants. And therefore, you can really reduce any kind of Fusarium outbreaks. The number one thing, though, this one, Regalia does really well. But really, the best thing to do is when you go to transplant is to not to overwater. Really, when I transplant my clones, into a pot, or I go to transplant outside, I try to make sure that root zone is maybe half as much saturated as it should be for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and that really helps to broaden the roots out into the soil, but not over wet them to become waterlogged, which then results in root rot. Next slide. So we at Marone Bio, our products, as you should know, are registered. And they're registered with the EPA. What that means is that we have to have efficacy in order to get, allowed to have your label and to be sold. You have to show real data, real research that shows real data. Now, this separates us from a lot of other products that you might see in your hydro store or agricultural thing, in that we have many years of different, data sets showing our products work. So here's one data set from Farm Forest Research up in Ontario. This is done on cannabis. So you see that the percent incidence of powdery mildew and bud rot is what the bars represent. So on the left side, you see a dark brown bar that represents powdery mildew, and then the light brown bar is how much bud rot it had at the end of the trial. And if you notice to the right, if you just add Regalia CG at either 1 quart per acre or 2 quarts per acre and 3 quarts per acre, you can significantly reduce not only your powdery mildew, but your botrytis bud rot. And in fact, what I tell most people is if you do the Regalia, you should get at least 50% reduction in both of those diseases across the board. So that's a very easy couple applications to get a major effect on reducing the major disease. Next. And of course, if you try to, if you reduce how much bud rot you get at the end and you control your powdery mildew, you're going to be much healthier. You'll have much healthier plants that produces better yields and more marketable flower. So the untreated controls, you can see at about 640 grams of buds, marketable buds, whereas the Regalia treatments had much more marketable buds at the end. And so even in an increase of, let's say, 50 to 60 grams was definitely worth all these sprays combined. Next slide. So here's what we're looking at, the difference between 2 products. So maybe you guys have heard of a product called Battery Stop. It's one of very few product out on the market that's designed or targeted for botrytis. And so we went up against it for a study done here in Oregon City on hemp. And you can see on the left-hand side is the untreated. So this is the side of the field that was not treated. And at the end of the trials, you see that there's about 65% of bud rot. So that is an extreme amount of bud rot in a field. Obviously, this is a very good trial for doing research. The botry stop did fairly well. It reduced the disease severity down to about 45% in the field. So that was decent. But if you did Stargus at 2 quarts per acre and you did that 6 times, we can reduce that down to about 20%. Now, 20%, at a disease severity of 65%, that's a pretty darn good trial right there, and it can just shows you. And for your growers out there, you almost never will get to disease severity of 65% of botrytis bud rot. That's really high. So just be aware of that. So the next slide basically shows that Stargus biofungicide reduces the bud rot on hemp. Is another trial in 2019. And you can see the untreated control of the disease severity, again, was very high. And Stargus at 2 quarts, you can see that it was even, it recreated basically the same thing. High disease severity, low amount of disease with Stargus. Okay, so real quick, as far as Regalia CG, I believe, Tim, I'm going to take this side of things, yeah?
I can pick it up here, Matt, if you want.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that? You're the tech rep. So
Okay, so just real quick, the products that Matt was talking about, Regalia is a plant extract. You can see the labeled right there as 1 to 4 quarts. And all the products that we'll mention here, they're all OMRI listed. They're all MRL exempt. They have 0 days to harvest, a minimal PPE required, and 4-hour reentry. And by and large, they tend to be very compatible with other materials. So go to the next slide. Mode of action of Regalia, it's important to note that is solely through induced systemic resistance and systemically acquired resistance, so it does not have direct activity in the pathogen. That means it has to be used in a preventative matter, as well as having the plant health aspect. So it's not a reach back or rescue type material. Next slide. Also has a positive effect on chlorophyll content, as Matt mentioned, so that has a positive overall effect in terms of plant growth. So it has both a plant health function as well as a fungicide mode of action. Next. Also has a good effect on hemp transplants. So you can put it through the drip irrigation or through the transplant water when you're first established in your field. And you can see a very nice effect in this example. We had 2 drenches of Regalia in the greenhouse. Definitely helps those transplants get started in the field, whether it be hemp or a fruiting crop such as tomatoes, for example. Season-long program-wise, in this case, Regalia was used as a transplant and root drench as well as on the foliage, and it really has a very significant effect for plant health, and it doesn't require a particularly high use rate for that plant health effect. Next slide. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We've got kind of pick up the pace here just a bit. Stargus is our other fungicide. It's quite different than Regalia. This one is based on an isolate of Bacillus necamurri or Bacillus amyloliquefaciens. Similar use rate, but in this case, we are looking for direct activity on specific diseases, especially botrytis. And this is based on the lipopeptides that are in the fermentation byproduct or in the fermentation broth, if you will. It does also trigger some SAR, ISR type activity, but we believe the activity by and large is due to these lipopeptides. Again, it has all the beneficial attributes of an OMRI listed product. Next slide. Mode of action is different in that in this example, we see direct activity from the lipopeptides that prevent the expansion of growth of the disease that we're after. And the nice thing about Regalia and Stargus is whereas Regalia is very strong on powdery mildew, Stargus is very strong on botrytis, so they have a very good complementary diseases that are being targeted. Next slide. And then JetAg is sort of our rescue or reach back type product. In this case, it's the peroxyacetic acid. It functions by oxidation of cell membranes. And so it is a contact spray. And when it contacts the diseased organisms, it kills them. But once it's dry, it has no residual activity. It is an army-listed product, but it's important to note that it does have different PPE requirements. This is a material that has to be handled with caution. So it's important that, that you keep that in mind. Let's go to the next slide. And let's go ahead and go to the entomology section here because we are a little bit behind schedule. Next slide. So it's important to remember that early prevention, whether it be plant disease or insects, is important. So when we started to grow hemp out in the field, one of the big experiments was, well, what kind of pests were we going to see? And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that we saw some of the ones that we would expect based on greenhouse production of cannabis. Things such as hemp russet mites. Next slide. Two-spotted spider mites. And for all of these mites, basically what we have for control measures are both Grandivo and Venerate, as well as azadirachtin, certain oils, and pyrethrins. The key here is, of course, that these insects are very small, so you have to scout very carefully to see if you have an infestation. Next slide. Thrips, of course, are a pest anytime you're growing almost anything in the greenhouse. Very difficult to control. They tend to get down in the flower buds. They seem to like flowers of crops. Here we like Venerate CG as well as potassium salts of fatty acid type products, which are a contact type material, or Grandivo in combination with azadirachtin, oils, and pyrethrins. Next slide. And then we also have some aphids that we have to deal with, both up on the leaf, the cannabis aphid, as well as the rice root aphid. And these root aphids are a bit of a surprise to us, but they can be quite a severe problem. They're very difficult to control. And the foliar aphids are difficult to control. So Venerate and Grandivo have some applications there, as well as Impede, which is a potassium salt fatty acid product. Botanigard has a role, azadirachtin, as well as oils. There's an entomogenous fungus called PFR97 that can be used, as well as pyrethrins. Aphids can be very difficult to control. It definitely takes multiple products to keep their numbers down. Next slide. What was really interesting, though, is what we saw in the field, where we saw some pests that we did not expect whatsoever. And one of those is beet leafhopper, which transmits beet curly top virus. It's a severe problem because if that plant becomes infected with that virus, you're basically going to lose that plant. In the southeastern U.S., where I live, we saw problems the year before last with wireworms. Again, we did not expect this. Wireworms are larvae of click beetles. They have multi-year life cycles, so they get to be fairly large when they overwinter. And one wireworm can take out an entire plant. So when you lose the entire plant, that's a pretty significant loss, and we did not expect those. Next question, or next slide. We have a question, had a question popped up that we'll definitely get to at the end here about regalia. Some general Lepidoptera feeders that we really weren't too surprised to see are corn earworm and armyworms. They're notoriously difficult to control even with conventional materials. Armyworms are defoliators. By and large, a hemp plant can take a lot of defoliation without any loss in yield. So if you're getting some chewing out there on the leaves, it's really not that much to worry about. But the corn earworm is different because it's a general feeder, but it prefers the fruiting structure. So it likes to get in the bud. And once it starts feeding in the bud, the botrytis also gets in there. So you have an insect that's definitely getting into to where the money is. Next slide. So the key to corn earworm control is scouting. This is an egg on a leaf. If you've been a cotton entomologist, this is as normal as getting up in the morning and breathing. But if you're not a cotton field scout, checking for corn earworm eggs might seem pretty difficult, but it's actually not that hard to do. The key is to know when the flights are occurring, especially if you're in a production area where you also have corn and cotton being grown. You need to know when those flights are occurring and when those eggs are being laid, because you have to time your applications of what you're going to use for control right when those eggs are hatching. Next slide. Considerations for corn earworm treatment, you have to get them when they're small, and that means first or second instar. If they're third instar, game over. You're not going to control them. If they originated from a corn or cotton field, they've probably been exposed to a GMO BT trait. They may have reduced susceptibilities to some of our BTK products, such as Dipel and Javelin, that would otherwise be a foundation for controlling corn earworm. So that leaves us also with BT subspecies Izawa products, such as Xantari, as well as Venerate in a tank mix that can be the foundation of corn earworm management. And there's also some viruses that are being evaluated that look like they have potential for control of corn earworm. Spray coverage is extremely important. Use water-sensitive carbs to make sure you're getting penetration. Hemp has a crop canopy unlike anything else we've ever seen. It is really dense. Next slide. Just real quick, overview of Venerate. It's a 1 to 4 quart per acre product. The active ingredient is heat-killed Burkholderia rhodogensis. So it's the metabolites that are doing the activity. It's a fairly slow-acting product. Safe to pollinators and beneficials, and has the positive attributes of a non-relisted product. Next slide. Grandivo is also a metabolite-based product. Again, it's a non-viable bacteria. It's a different species, Chromobacterium. It's a dry product, a WDG instead of a liquid, but also low risk to pollinators and beneficials. Again, fairly slow acting. It's just a different mode of action. It's more inhibiting reproduction and stopping the pests from feeding, as well as death that occurs later. So they act a little bit differently in the field. Next slide. Again, so this is a list of some of the beneficials that we've tested with both Venerate and Grandivo, both for acute toxicity and for longer term effects on reproduction, and we've not seen any issues whatsoever. And we've got up to 3x the maximum field rate. So these products can be used in combination with beneficial insects. So it's a good integrated program that can definitely help out, because you're going to need multiple approaches, especially for the worm control. Couple data slides. This is two-spotted spider mite on cannabis, greenhouse cannabis in Canada. A very high level of control with both Grandivo and Venerate. It's all about the timing of the application. Get it in there when you first see that you have those mites. Next slide. And root mealybug, a new pest that we're looking at. Venerate and Grandivo both do a pretty good job when doing soil or media drenches on a 7-day interval. So this is kind of a new area for us. Next slide. So just to emphasize a few key points from this entomology section. It's all about scouting, early intervention, making sure you maintain your beneficial insects out in the field so you get the help from them. Know your pest identification, so get to know your handlings. Scouting, coverage. That means you may need to use drop nozzles to get penetration inside that canopy and get good coverage, and make sure you know what the pests that you're seeing in the field actually are. Always prefer to use hollow cone nozzles when we're spraying for insect control. We tend to get better coverage that way. Next slide. Just a little shout out to some of the information we have on our website about hemp and cannabis programs. We're always trying to keep that updated and add new materials. So go to Marone Bio for more information. And then I think the next slide lists the, we have an IPM pest guide that we have available. Again, it's available to download on our website. And we do have a host of agronomists in the field. And that's on the next slide, which is our field sales force. You can see nationally there. And Matt heads up the cultivated garden section. And then the next slide, we also have expert agronomists, our technical support group, Pacific Northwest, the Desert Southwest, Midwest, Northeast, and myself in the Southeast. So we think we have it pretty well covered, and we're out there to help you grow good quality hemp. So I think we have some time for some questions now.
Okay, thanks, Tim and Matt, for that. I see we have a few questions in the chat. We have about 10 minutes left, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. First question is there a good place to find which pesticides are allowed in cannabis and hemp for the USA for all states?
Well, Ben, actually, I was going to ask you if that was something that Acres was providing then to hemp growers in terms of a kind of a consolidated location where growers can go to, because I don't know of one off the top of my head, unless
Okay.
EPA has one.
Okay, well, we can move on and maybe take that question offline.
I
Do you
will
have,
say that we have it for our products. So if if you ask where our products are done, we have a whole master list of all the states that are registered and approved for different uses.
great. Okay, we have another question. Have you done any experiment on hemp seed treatment with regalia and Stargus?
Yeah, we have. We've been participating in an IR4 sponsored program for looking at seed treatments, and so far we've not seen anything that has been successful yet. That's being headed up by a researcher up at Cornell, with the primary target being Pythium control. So we don't have anything to announce there. We're hopeful because seed treatment's a real focus for us internally as a company, and it's a pretty important part of our business. But trying to figure out the correct dose rate has been a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Do you have any suggestions on application spray volume and application methods?
Yeah, it's my good friend Dan Ramsdale posted that question there. I saw. Well, and I tried to kind of get it into a little bit at the end of my narrative. I think, and I don't know if many people are doing it, but I would think the drop nozzles with a mounted horizontally to get into that canopy might be useful. That used to be a pretty common practice in corn production for European corn borer control when you're trying to get down around that ear zone, but I don't know how readily available that is in hemp. You need to make sure you have a fine enough droplet size to get in there. And water sensitive paper can really be important to stick inside that canopy. You don't have to do it very, very far down the field in various places within the hemp plant, and then pull them out and see where you're getting coverage. You might either be
And I
pleasantly
would just
surprised or terribly disappointed.
I would just add that whatever application you're doing, make sure that it's targeting where you want it to go. So if you're targeting for Botrytis bud rot, obviously you want that spray to be up where the colas are, forming and filling in, obviously, and not so much down in the canopy per se. So, yeah.
And I would add, Ben, that I think there's always a little bit of perception that to get better coverage, you need more water. And there's a point of diminishing returns when you do that, because you can over dilute a product. So, given the size of a hemp plant out in the field, and I think of similar crops, I would think probably a minimum of like 40 gallons per acre for a ground application, maybe up to 60 or so. But, I think if you go too high, you could easily over dilute the products and lose some efficacy there.
Okay. Next question. Are there problems with fogging sprayers that heat up the product, in particular if you were using something like Stargus?
We are, and I'll definitely want Matt to comment. We're definitely okay fogging with regalia and with venerate. We do not recommend fogging with Grandivo, just simply because of its physical composition. Starkus, I hadn't really thought about. I guess it would depend a little bit on how high the temperature is and how long it stays warm. I don't think it would hurt the lipopeptides. It might prevent the spores from germinating, but I'm not sure that's particularly important.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to just add that another question came up, and this is what we get all the time actually, is can I mix products together? And so what I want to make sure everyone on this phone call knows is that Marone Bio's products are actually different than most other products out there. Our two bioinsecticides are based on bacteria and the metabolites that they produce. However, when you buy Grandivo CG and Venerate CG, there is no live bacteria in there. So we don't have to worry about, this product, mix in and kill, whatever Venerate and, Grandivo's stuff is. No, it's just metabolites. And there's no bacteria to kill, so that is it's great because we're one of the few products out there that does the activity without having to be alive to do it.
Are electrostatic sprayers ideal for biologicals? And this will probably be our last question. We're right up at 12:40.
Yeah, and of course you've heard the difference between a cold fogger, an auto fogger, and a hot fogger. In general, anything that's biologically active, so if you have a live spore, like a Stargus or Javelin or Botanigard or PFR97, things like that, you definitely want to stay away from oxidizers, so like the peracetic acid, hydrogen peroxide. You want to stay away from, so basically just things that kill. And of course, the hot foggers, it's not a cold fogger. The hot foggers will kill some of those biologicals. So that's why people generally, if they're going to buy a fogger, they're going to go with the cold foggers because it gives them more flexibility for different applications. So sorry, just want to make sure I got that point.
Great. Okay, I think that's all the time we have. And I want to thank Matt and Tim and Marone Bio Innovations. I also want to let you know about an upcoming event from Acres USA, the all-day Advancing Hemp event on May 20th. We'll bring together industry-leading experts and growers who will dive deep into seed selection, soil analysis, crop nutrition, and farming systems. This event is designed for experienced and new hemp growers who want to learn what it takes to increase CBD percentages, boost yields, and develop a more profitable, high-quality crop. The event features experts such as John Kemp, Gary Redding, Ray French, Whitney Cranshaw, and Gary Chavez. Go to acresusa.com/events for more information on that. I also want to take a moment to look to tell you about an online course that Acres USA offers called A Grower's Guide to Regenerative Hemp, which is taught by author, activist, and hemp farmer Doug Fine. Go to learn.acresusa.com to learn more about that. Thanks to everyone who attended this webinar, and thanks again to Marone Bio. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Ross.